I think we're still in a trade war. We had a tariff pause, a few weeks ago after Treasury Secretary Bessent and USTR Greer met with their Chinese counterparts, and we had that, terrific lowering, reducing of the tariff levels on both sides. And I think that led everybody to breathe a big sigh of relief. And we thought, maybe we were going to have stability in the relationship moving forward, at least, for the next 90 days, and perhaps some movement toward an actual, negotiation and agreement. But I think the Trump administration really divorced that set of discussions and negotiations from everything else that they wanted to get done with China. And I think what we've seen now is that means, no cessation of tough measures, whether, as you mentioned, is continuing, export controls or now this revocation of student visas. So I think we're still in the midst of a trade war. We're in the midst of a significant strategic decoupling. And all we had really was a tariff pause.
Hey, Elizabeth, what does the world look like with an increasingly decoupled U.S. and China?
I mean, I think it's going to be complicated. I think it's not going to be as straightforward as some people might imagine with, the U.S. and its allies and partners on one side and China and its partners on another side, because it doesn't actually have any formal allies except for North Korea. So I think it's not going to be that simple. And I think we've seen evidence of that, where President Trump went to the Middle East and came back with all these big announcements of new trade arrangements and investments and defense deals. And we just saw China this past week do the exact same thing and bring the countries from Southeast Asia into it and try to sort of bridge from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, sort of new trade and investment relations. And so I think it's going to be, everybody out to try to compete for partners and allies and strike the best deals. But there's not going to be that sort of decoupling of the world that I think probably the Trump administration has in its mind, because, for many and for most countries, quite frankly, China is their largest trading partner.
Right.
And while they don't want to lose the U.S. market, they're also not willing to sacrifice their trade and investment ties with China.
So what happened to the argument that we've said, okay, there's tensions, but let's not forget, people, these two countries, the two largest economies in the world, they still kind of need each other. Is that still the case?
I think within the Trump administration, there's a range of opinions. And I think it, goes from somebody like Peter Navarro, who would be perfectly happy to have not just a strategic decoupling, but really a complete decoupling of the two economies. I think the sort of on the national security side, most of the, cabinet members are quite hawkish when it comes to China. And then I think there are some in the administration, and maybe Treasury Secretary Bessent, maybe Commerce Secretary Lutnick, who see the benefits of trade and investment with China and have made very clear that, while the relationship is challenged, they want to continue to engage. They don't see anything past a strategic decoupling. They're not looking, and I think Secretary Bessent made that clear, they're not looking for a complete decoupling of the relationship. But it is fraught. And a lot of that has to do not just with what the Trump administration is trying to do now, but with what Xi Jinping has been doing, for 12 years as General Secretary of the Communist Party and President of the country, which is really challenging the United States, challenging the liberal rules-based international order on issues like, pushing to have the de-dollarization of the global economy, pushing for the end of the U.S.-led alliance system, pushing for a whole new definition of human rights. So there are some pretty substantive ways in which our two countries are in real conflict, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to try to find areas of common ground and common purpose. And that, frankly, is what is entirely missing from this administration.
I'm trying to understand, and I think a lot of us are trying to understand the position that China can negotiate from right now. On the one hand, there's a consumer in China that's under pressure. The property crisis there, the economy has been under pressure, going really back to COVID. But at the same time, what we've learned is that in recent years, the country's made incredible strides when it comes to driverless car technology, EV technology, and some of the really high-tech stuff that, in fact, the U.S. is trying to prevent the proliferation of in China. What can you tell us about the position of strength or weakness that China can negotiate from right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a fundamental miscalculation on the part of the Trump administration when they first began these negotiations. There's sort of an assumption that, in fact, because we import so much more from China than China imports from us, that somehow we had all the leverage. But the truth is, first of all, we have a much greater single source or sole source dependency on China for certain goods. So about 30% of the goods that we import from China, we are reliant for China for 70% or more of those goods globally. China doesn't have that with the United States. We've already seen China has spent, 4 years now or more moving away from the United States, reducing their trade dependence since 2019, reducing their trade dependence on the United States from about 19% to now 14%. Our soybeans, right? Even after the tariff pause, China's not back to purchasing the same level of soybeans from American farmers. Brazil is more competitive, so they're purchasing their soybeans from Brazil. So one of the big dangers of this Trump-launched tariff war is that China was already on a path to its own form of strategic decoupling, and now it's just accelerated that process. So I think we misjudged, right, their dependence, their reliance on us. As you suggested, the Chinese economy is troubled. It has been since COVID. It hasn't bounced back. But China has the ability to suppress, right, the people in ways that the US government does not. And at the same time, their entire innovation and advanced manufacturing ecosystem has just taken off after the past 4 years. And so you're really dealing with two different Chinese economies. And for the sake of the tariff war, we should be focused on the one that's most competitive in that tech and innovation space. And so we really need to focus on what we should be doing at home, investing in ourselves and moving ourselves forward, as opposed to simply trying to look backwards and trip China up with these tariffs.
It's a tariff war, right? We should remind everybody that also this week, the administration seeking to block Huawei Technologies from selling advanced AI chips anywhere in the world, prompting an angry rebuke from Beijing. Elizabeth, it is about tech and tariffs. It's also, though, we had this week the Trump administration announcing it would start revoking Chinese student visas. So there's also that aspect that's going on. Who loses in that restriction? The U.S., Beijing, everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides lose, just like the tariff war. Both sides lose. I mean, truth be told, there are reasons to be concerned about some Chinese students in the United States. I mean, we saw a number of years ago where the U.S. sent back 1,000 Chinese students and postdocs who, had affiliations with Chinese military and technology universities and institutes, who were probably placed here by the Chinese government to access, advanced intellectual property from the labs that they were working in. So they weren't real graduate students or postdocs. We want to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. That being said, the vast majority of Chinese students are here to learn, to take advantage of the openness and the outstanding education that American institutions provide. A lot of the students that come here in the STEM fields end up staying and contributing in an outsized way to our own innovation ecosystem. I don't think we want to punish, these students. I think what we need to do is take our time and figure out how to use a scalpel to, review them before they get here and keep out the bad elements, but let in the vast majority of Chinese students who are such important contributors to our own success moving forward.
We're speaking with Elizabeth Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and Co-Chair of the Program on the U.S., China, and the World at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She's written many books, including The World According to China. Given your expertise in the area, I'm just curious, from your perspective, how you think we, as the United States, or if you were advising the Trump administration, how we should handle the relationship with China. What would you do?
That's a big question. I mean, to be frank, I served in the Biden administration in the Department of Commerce as a senior advisor to Secretary Raimondo for China. And so I actually think the Biden administration strategy was a pretty good one, right? Because it focused on first investing at home and making sure that our own innovation and advanced manufacturing, was up to speed. CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, all of these were about making sure that the U.S. was able to compete with China in the 21st century. We also had a vision that it was important to work with our allies and partners. Because nothing that we do alone is going to be sufficient to compete with China. If we put an export control, on a certain technology, odds are high that one or other of our allies might also have something similar. We need them on board to put controls on those same technologies, if in fact they're not going to end up backfilling, right? So that just our industries suffer and somebody else makes money. But the way the Trump administration is operating, it's hardly likely that our allies and partners are going to be excited to work with us because, everything we're doing to China, or not everything, but a lot of things we're doing to China, we're also doing to them. And then there was an element of modernizing our defensive economic tools so that we could protect ourselves, our national economic security. So yes, let's think about making sure we're not too dependent on China for critical minerals and rare earth elements and the processing of those things. Let's make sure we're not too dependent on them for any critical technologies, for personal protective equipment that we needed during COVID. Mm-hmm. I think that's smart policy, and the Trump administration is going to continue that.
Elizabeth,
but above all, also tried to maintain channels of communication and to continue to try to find areas where we could work with China. Because through all of this, right, we don't want this conflict to devolve into kinetic conflict. And if we're not talking, if we're not trying to work together, the likelihood of that happening just increases.
Your book, The World According to China, that was out about 3.5, 4 years ago, I believe, right? 2021. When you look at the next 50 years, 100 years, is it going to be better for China or better for the U.S.? And forgive me, but just about 35 seconds here.
Okay, I'm always going to be bullish on the United States. So I think if we get it right, and I think if we
Is that your heart speaking or your head speaking?
Yeah, no, I think, listen, China has some pretty fundamental challenges, and we haven't had a chance to talk about these on this particular show, but there are some deep-seated, deep-rooted issues that the Chinese government is confronting.
Yeah.
We only lose if we continue to do what we're doing right now, which is reduce uncertainty and chaos into the system.